Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. Today's video is an album review on Dead Can Dance, 1984 self-titled album. Dead Can Dance were an Australian band, pretty much a post-punk sound um, for the most part. Started in 1980, moved to UK in 1982 and signed with 4AD Records, and kind of was the foundation sound of the label in many ways, and along with Cocteau Twins, it became the most successful or well-respected bands of the label, along with maybe like Mortal Coil and a couple others. The main two members of the band are Lisa Gerrard and then, of course, Brendan Perry of the band. My interest in, or my finding of their music started in the late 90s with these three or the early 80s, early 90s, excuse me, with these three albums here. So that was kind of the foundation of my learning of their sound. In the early 90s, I was just kind of, well, I should say late 80s, I was starting to get a foundation of different styles of ambient music and new age music and soundtrack music. And by the 90s when these came out, I would probably, there was a lot of ethnic ambient that I was sort of getting into, and eastern sounding down tempo and things like that, and a lot of different artists and labels I was following. And that was certainly a strong, although I for people that know me better, know I really like space ambient is my favorite, but I also really enjoy cultural ambient styles, whether it be, like, or just sounds of certain areas, like dub techno from Iceland, or the Cologne techno sound from Germany, or the trance sound from Frankfurt, or Detroit techno, or Chicago house, or even Los Angeles gangster rap, or whatever. I've always been kind of interested in knowing the pockets of certain genres over the last 40 years, and how they kind of evolved and started, and how they specifically sound to that region and influence. And I always found it kind of fascinating what they were influenced by to make that sound. And one of those styles I've been really interested in is Australian music, and kind of having that Aboriginal sound and that cultural sound, and it kind of sounding like a different kind of Eastern sound, like very tribal, very I wouldn't say it's very. I mean, there's certainly a lot of atmosphere in there, but it's not atmosphere that's. It kind of, I always kind of think of like the atmosphere of certain sounds and of certain countries kind of sounds like that country. Like Australia is a big continent, so I would think of the sound would be sort of desert and tribal and very ancient sounding, but maybe a combination of Aboriginal, and then maybe if you went to like Aztec, or or even Indian, or certain tribal sounds of certain areas, that would be even more like mysticism and maybe a little bit more spiritualism and stuff like that. And I have a lot of that style of music as well. And I think when I found Dead Can Dance, I was excited about what I heard, but I wasn't like over the moon about it. With these three albums, and one of the things I started doing with this channel was, it would just kind of, when I started doing reviews and picking out what albums to review, one of the main reasons why I started this was I could fill in the gaps and find albums that I hadn't heard before, or wanted to revisit, or maybe I just missed. And one of those was the first 4 or 5 albums from Dead Can Dance, basically all their 80s work into about 1990. These are the only 3 albums I've ever heard of Dead Can Dance. And I may have heard of a song here or there on a compilation. And when I was going through the debut album Dead Can Dance, I didn't recognize any. So that was, but I don't know if I'll recognize any, if any of you know, I do have some compilations with them on it, but I don't know if they were individual tracks or songs from albums. But I so far through this album, I didn't recognize any songs. Um, so when I think of the sound of the band, this is, I was over the years I've kind of heard that, kind of looking into Dead Can Dance, it was kind of, there's kind of two periods or two sounds of them. Kind of the '80s sounds is a little bit more, or the '90s sounds is a little bit more. I wouldn't say it's like neo folk or anything like that. It's really kind of like, um, ethnic music. I think some people call it like ethnic ambient or. But there's certainly a lot of electronic sounds, but there's also a lot of folk in there. But it's very cultural as well. Like it sounds like it could be music that was from the 1500s, like some kind of like Bedouin chant music and stuff like that. And after looking into their career over the last few years, and then starting this channel, I've been wanting to get in their early stuff because I've heard that it's a little bit more post punk, and so that kind of got me excited to check out their music. And I'm going to review their albums in a row. So I figured I wanted to kind of, obviously I know their later albums. I don't know their 2005 album. I don't know in fact, I don't know any of the 2005, I think 2012 and 2018 album. They're new ones. I haven't heard those, but I'll go through all of them. And I figured I'd start with the first album. That would make the most sense, so I can really kind of get to know their trajectory and their patterning of what they evolved through. And so I was really excited to kind of hear the post rock version of this in the earlier times. Of course, I've always been a big fan of Cocteau Twins. So in many ways, I've always been kind of like, why haven't I checked out Dead Can Dance, early albums yet? But that's the great thing about, there's a reason why I've done that over the years too. Is if you saw my collection, and you would see like, oh, there's maybe one album in almost every artist that I have, or one piece of music, whether I have it or not, that I haven't heard yet. And the reason for that is like, I always kind of keep, for the most part, most of the bands, I always keep like some unheard music that I haven't got a chance to check out by most bands. And I do that because on a rainy day, I call it my rainy day selection. And for almost every artist, I have like a sealed record or one that I haven't heard, especially in electronic music that I just haven't got around to yet. And I keep it for that time when I can first break it out and be like, oh, I got something I haven't heard by that particular artist, and I can, as if they were releasing new music. And I've always kind of done that for the last like 25 or 30 years. And so even though I've wanted to check out Dead Can Dance, I wanted to have like a reason to do it and not just pull it up on YouTube and listen to it. For the most part, if I don't have it, I generally don't buy it. I mean, I don't go listen to it. So, I bought these, so I know these. But a lot of times if I didn't see it in a record store and I didn't buy it, then I wouldn't get a chance to hear it, because I always wanted to hear. I also wanted to hear music on my stereo for the first time and really get a chance to enjoy it. But doing this channel, kind of bend the rules a little bit on that, and I can't buy everything by every band. So there's going to be some stuff where I'm going to debut it without having it, and this is the case. But I think this channel gives me the opportunity to really kind of check out music that I haven't got around to checking out yet, and kind of fill in the gaps. So yeah, I'm excited that I got a chance to hear this and to hear the post rock sound. And there's a little bit of goth in here. I wouldn't say there's a lot of goth. I can see how. I think maybe the misconception is that people, and I don't know if this, I'm just kind of assuming, but a lot of people that like goth music, I'm not sure how much they like electronic music or ambient music, because if they did, then maybe they would understand that this is more ethnic and and ethnic ambient and tribal and not so much goth. Like I mean, it's almost like everything that sort of sounds like it's through a tunnel and that kind of Joy Division slash Cures kind of sound. Anything with a little bit of mysticism or something like that would be kind of romantic and sort of goth sound. And I don't know if I really hear a lot of goth in here per se. I kind of wish that the Mission like would sort of incorporate a little bit of this style into their music. Sometimes it just when I was listening to some of it because it's post a little bit post punk and people kind of say Dead Can Dance is somewhat goth. I kind of put those two together. Okay, well what's kind of post punk and sort of goth. Okay, well example would be like the Mission. Wow, I wish the Mission kind of did some songs like this as well. That would be really cool. So that kind of popped into my head when I first started to kind of hear the first couple tracks. I think when it comes to the singing, it's a nice combination that it seems that Lisa kind of does one song, he kind of does another song. So I like that you get a good balance. It almost sounds like there's two songs with her, three songs on her, there's three songs with him. There's a few instrumentals, and you kind of get you don't really get you like the variation, and you don't really get sick of any particular one. Not that you would get sick of it, but it's kind of a nice mix of the both, and so I appreciate that. I really do like both of their voices too. They're very believable, which I think is very important if you're going to do like any kind of cultural music. Like if you're going to do any kind of like ethnic ambient music, or I did a review on Bel Cantu, and obviously they're from Norway, so yeah, they're going to sound Norwegian, but if you're from another country and you're trying to sound like Norwegian, right, like, or if you're from like obviously if you're Caucasian and you're doing Indian music, there has to be a little bit of believable that you're really into it, or you're really about that, about understanding the cadences and does your voice work well with the music. And I'm happy to say both Lisa and Brandon sound really good with the music and very believable. Like her voice in Musica Internal and Ocean, for example, are really nice and different, and kind of her high pitched voice and her echo on her voice and everything like that really works with the music. So that's kind of a check mark that I look for in this type of music, that like tonal wise and the coloring of the music and everything like that fits really well together. I think that's probably why I had a hard time with a recent review I did on Delirium by the gentleman, by Bill Lieb and Reese Fulber from Frontline Assembly. I'm thinking two industrial guys from dance music are doing down-tempo music that sort of sounds like Eastern, and it really didn't fully work for me because a lot of the chanting sounded very contrived and very basic, and kind of more sounded like a Balearic kind of down-tempo cheesy track than really kind of Dead Can Dance kind of deeper style. So that was kind of an example where maybe the voices and maybe the production, although it was still pretty solid, maybe isn't as good as something like Dead Can Dance, as far as that good example of somebody who can do ethnic styled music. When I think of the guitars, it's kind of a nice mix as well. Some of it's kind of post rock, kind of jangled, screeching. I wouldn't say, take that word lightly, screeching. It's kind of, a few of the tracks in there earlier wouldn't say screeching, but they're kind of, it's kind of a higher pitched guitar sound, and they're kind of like a certain like note, and it's kind of cascading in kind of a higher pitched sound. But there is also a good combination of like patterns, riffs, and strums, and some are a little bit more atmospheric, like East and Eden, for example. So I liked all the differences of the guitar sounds. Of course, when you do like ethnic ambient stuff like this and folk, the percussion and the the rhythm section has to be probably the most important thing. And I'm happy to say it's a really good combination of various drumming. Sometimes it's like stark tribal sounds. Sometimes it's a good change, sort of rhythmic drumming like on Frontier and the track Threshold. And then also the bass really kind of ties it in as well to the more rock side, because the bass lines are very kind of almost like Joy Division in some ways, and I think that's where the post punk kind of comes in. Um, so some of the bass sounds are really good, like in Fatal Impact or Fortune or Frontier. There's some nice, good kind of post punk bass lines that really kind of tie it into the post rock. So I mean post punk sound. So that's kind of where the balance is really strong, because you got the voices that are balanced. You got some instrumentals, and then you got the balance of ethnic ambient and also a post punk sound, and then you have some really kind of vintage production. Like early Cocteau Twins have that. Early Joy Division have that. Some of the uh, better post punk bands have that sort of vintage kind of. It's almost hard to describe. It almost sounds like it's recorded in like a old abandoned factory or something like that. It's a little bit cold. I wouldn't say it's like sounding like a hallway or anything, because it's not narrow in any ways, but it sounds like the guitar player's like in a different room, or the drummer's in a different room, and it's not acoustically treated rooms. It's kind of, I wouldn't say they're like super cold, but maybe they're like in cement buildings. Like maybe it's that echo, but it's not so much. It's not that cold. It's kind of hard to explain, but you kind of get what I'm saying if you kind of know the. It's almost like a cold wave sound. I mean, that's kind of like the style, right? It was cold wave bands, and the resurgence of that genre in the late 2000s is kind of based on how Joy Division and bands like this sounded in 1978 to like 85, right? That kind of post-punk sound. So that's kind of what I say I mean what I mean when I say kind of that vintage kind of post-punk sound. This certainly has it. The atmosphere is excellent, and as the album kind of goes on, it gets better. I really like the second half of the album even more so than the first album. The first side of the album, I was put off a little bit by a couple tracks, but for the most part, I was hanging in there and looking forward to what was coming. But there was a part where I was like, oh, maybe this isn't going to be as good as I hoped it would be. But the second half of the album really kind of took it there for me, and so I was happy to hear that. One thing I also wanted to point out about the album was there's some good pop choruses going on here, like in Fortune and in The Passage of Time. Like even though they're kind of ethnic ambient and post punk and stuff like that, there's still some really good some choruses in here, some stuff that you can kind of familiarize yourself with a little bit, or is easier to grasp onto right away. So it almost seems like a great combination of instrumental music and also pop music, and it really seems to cover the basis of ethereal goth rock and sort of tribal and all the styles that one would sort of describe this. It really does a good job of incorporating all of them and kind of giving a good dose of each, and again tied to that kind of post punk sound. As far as the a few of the tracks, the individual tracks rating them, I'll kind of go through this kind of quick. I don't want to make this video too long, but the Fatal Impact, 3.25 stars. The Trial, probably my least favorite song on the album, along with Ocean, 2.25 stars. Frontier, I like it a little bit more dramatic. This is kind of what I thought their earlier sound would sound like when I heard that they sort of incorporated more post punk. This is kind of what I thought they would sound like, which I gave Frontier 3 stars. But I was even more so impressed by the later songs including track number 4, Fortune, which sort of added the chorus, and I give that one 3.25 stars. So I like that even more so. Um, and then lastly, the first part of the first side, last part of the first side of the track Ocean. This one's kind of interesting because it's fairly straightforward, but it's a bit abrasive. And although I really like ethereal sounds and what she's doing on the track, I don't know if it really hits the deepness that I was hoping a track like this would sort of do. And it's a little bit abrasive. I wouldn't say I was kind of expecting or hoping if they did a track like this that it would be a little bit more softer, maybe a little bit more melancholy. But I appreciate because it's a little bit more aggressive. But it really doesn't. It doesn't. I don't know if the celestial sounds really coming from an ambient fan. Like I really don't feel like the celestial kind of sounds like really evolve in kind of a layered way that I think I think it could have been done better. And I don't think the layered sounds um, are really kind of evolving in kind of a enjoyable way. It's kind of again it could be this track could be because it's trying to be um, maybe a little bit more in your face than maybe ambient should be. I don't know. It's a I think I would like this track. I mean, I think it's a good track, and giving it 2.25 stars, I think it's a solid track. But I just feel like it could have been better. It could have been done a little differently. That was the confusing track for me on the album. But then the second half of the album just so strong. East of Eden, 3.25 stars. Threshold, my favorite track yet, 3.5 stars. Passage in Time. So kind of interesting pop kind of chorus in it. 3.25 stars. And then it ended with my favorite two tracks, Wild in the Woods. I like the darker side on here, 3.75 stars. And also Musica Eternal is my favorite track on the album. I love that it ends on this. The album ends on this track. I think it's a really excellent track, and I really like her voice in it, and the pacing and the long kind of fade in and long fade out. It's just a beautiful way to end the album, and a perfect example of what I look for when I think of like ethnic ambient music. 4 stars on that track. So overall, when I add up the stars, it's 31.75 track. Sorry, 31.75 stars divided by 10 songs, which is a 3.17. So some strong scores. Normally that would be a 72 or a 73 in my scoring, but considering this album is 1984, considering that the addition of post punk, just how well balanced this album is and how well it flows and finishes, I gave it quite a few extra points just for the overall atmosphere and the production and how ahead of the time this album was. I really feel that and that's one thing that I do appreciate about the Dead Can Dance albums that I knew before is the total is better than any particular songs. It's kind of Dead Can Dance for me seems like a band that you want to play the whole album with and take a trip with the whole album, versus play any one song and sort of have them on random with other music and sort of, oh, there's a Dead Can Dance song. Maybe I would do that with like ambient CDs. Like I've always wanted to get one of those 400 disc CD players that you can connect like 3 or 4 of them to and just put in 1600 ambient CDs and put them on random and have a great selection of sleeping music. I've always kind of wanted to do that, but I think maybe with that you could on random hear some Dead Can Dance work. But I think in general you want to play Dead Can Dance album from the start to the end, because it's something that I wouldn't say demands your attention, but I think that's the best way to sort of appreciate the album. But yeah, I gave the album an extra 5 points because of the atmosphere and being groundbreaking and just the overall sound of the album. I gave it a 78 out of 100. So it's very close to a genre classic. It's I think if the tracks The Trial and The Ocean were a little bit stronger, I think I'd put this in the 80s as a genre classic. I mean, it's hard not to say this isn't a genre classic of the style that you would say this album is. It's really close for me, but I think Ocean and The Trial sort of bring it down a little bit for me. Um, but it's very close to being a genre classic. It's going to be hard not to. It's going. I mean, I can't imagine putting anything higher than this in a rock ethnic way that sort of combines everything into a style like this. I mean, obviously that's why Dead Can Dance is highly revered. Will there be a Cocteau Twins album rated higher than 78? Probably, but Dead Can Dance isn't. They get compared a lot because they're on 4AD label, and I get it, but Dead Can Dance is definitely unique, and it really, in a lot of ways, if you grew, I could picture myself if I listened to this in 1984 and I grew up through the Dead Can Dance period. I could see like some of the ambient music that I was buying in the 90s that was sort of ethnic related. I could probably see how that might have been cheesy, a little bit cheesy, but when you come from more of an electronic side, you expect some down tempo beats and a little bit more electronic. But this is post punk and a little bit more folk. It's more folk than goth, or more folk than really post punk to me. I mean, if it has some echoey guitars and sort of has some pop structures, I can see how it's post punk. But there's a big kind of folk kind of feel. Maybe it's a folk rock more, or is there a post folk rock category? But yeah, really enjoyable album. It's a fun album to critique, and it's great to hear like like these are the albums that really make me think and really make me enjoy level music to a whole new level. I think you'll find, and sometimes I run into it, if I don't really have a lot to say about the album, the review might be obviously kind of boring, and it might be kind of short. If it's pushing 27 minutes, unless I have some kind of rant that I kind of go off, or some kind of other story that I might talk about in the video, I specifically talked about this one for 27 minutes for the most part. So, if it's a deep album and it's unique and groundbreaking, and it causes me to think deeper and try to express how I feel and how it makes me feel, and how historically it puts into perspective like where it sits in the lineage of this style of music and what was going on at the time. That you'll always know that on my reviews I always try to give some kind of historical perspective to it, because that's the angle that I look when I look into music like this, and that's why I gave it a couple extra points at the end, because it's I think this might be the most points I've given on top of roughly where I would score the album. If I was to score this album a 72, 73 based on the songs, and I felt like giving it an extra 5 points, I think that would be the maximum I've taken or I've given after giving the scores of the album. And that may happen more often with ambient music than pop music or new wave music or rock music. But, because the totality of the album is more important than any particular song, right? It's the trip. So that's what's more important with this style of music than your more 3-4 minute structured songs. In some ways, this album, even though they are individual songs, it does, and they're not segued into each other. They don't necessarily blend into each other. I think if they would have did that, I think I'd put this in the 80s. I think this would be an excellent album to kind of meld the songs in between each other with a little ambience and sounds in between. Very, very lightly done. I wouldn't overdo it, but if that was done and it sort of segued the songs into each other because they already blend so well together, I think that would have took this into the 80s as well, even with The Ocean and The Trial being good songs, but not necessarily higher rated songs by me. And that's why I almost took it into the 80s just by giving it a 5 or 6 point additional push. You won't see that very often with me with anything rock related because for the most part the songs are the foundation of what it is. But there's going to be some albums where the flow and the overall totality of it makes you feel like you want to give it extra points and kind of give it a higher rating. And that's where the conversational piece sort of starts with my reviews. If you notice, everything I put in the 70s, 70 to 79 is very good. So if I had something that was 68 and somebody asked me, well, what do you think of Dead Can Dance album? Well, I think it's a very good album. So I have to put it in the 70s, right? So that's why I have a basic term like good and pretty good and not bad or below average or excellent in there. I mean, it seems kind of corny to have those titles in the album as part of the scoring system, but that's conversationally, that's kind of my checks and balances of the ratings as well, because it's conversational. So somebody asked me, again, what do I think of this album? I'm going to say it's a very good album. So that's kind of why I have those labels along with my overall score. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of explain that. But yeah, when you hear an album like this, it just kind of makes you excited about music and makes you talk a lot more. So that's why this one went to 31 minutes. But yeah, so I'm gonna check out the rest of the Dead Can Dance albums probably over the next year or so. I think there's another 7 total albums, and then these 3, so probably another 10 albums I'll do. So yeah, maybe it'll take me a year or 2 to get through the rest of the albums, but I'm looking forward to that. And hopefully you'll be around to check out those reviews. But yeah, really strong album, 78 out of 100. Dead Can Dance debut album, really excellent. See, I almost said excellent. It was a very good album, almost excellent. All right, thanks so much. Oh, curious, what's your favorite Dead Can Dance album? Top 3. Can you give me your top 3 albums for Dead Can Dance? All right, thanks so much.